The sense that something has already begun settles quietly over the earliest Sumerian records. The tablets do not open with uncertainty, nor with trial and error. They begin in motion, as if the world they describe has been running for some time before the stylus touches clay. By the moment writing appears, institutions are already active. Labor is already assigned. Authority is already recognized. The record does not announce itself as a beginning, but as an entry point into an ongoing order. The oldest administrative tablets from southern Mesopotamia do not explain why grain is measured only much. They do not define what a temple is, only which household it serves, and which rations it distributes. The signs themselves appear standardized from their earliest use, suggesting that scribes were not inventing a system, but learning one. Writing emerges not as an experiment, but as a tool applied to a structure that already expects. The implication is subtle, but persistent. The need to write presupposes an established complexity. This is especially evident in how authority is treated. Early tablets refer to officials without introduction. Titles are used as if their meaning is already agreed upon. The word for king does not arrive with explanation or justification. It appears embedded in transactions, in offerings, in land assignments. Kingship is not narrated as an innovation. It is treated as a condition. Even the later historical compositions, such as the Sumerian king list, do not linger on how kingship came into existence. They are concerned instead with sequence, duration, and transfer. Kingship moves. It does not originate. The language of the texts reinforces this orientation. Verbs commonly imply continuation rather than initiation. Temples are maintained, fields are returned, rituals are performed again. There is little emphasis on first acts. When something new appears, it is framed as restoration after disruption. The scribes seem more interested in preserving order than celebrating novelty. This absence is not accidental. In historiography, what is not recorded often reveals as much as what is. Archaeologically, the same tension appears. Writing does not coincide with the first cities, but with cities already functioning. By the time clay tablets are impressed in large numbers, places like Uruk and Eridu are already layered with occupation. Streets have been walked, temples have been rebuilt. Administrative quarters have been reorganized more than once. Writing enters this environment not as a spark, but as an adaptation. It is fitted into an existing administrative memory. Even the format of the tablets reflects this. Many early examples are not narrative, but tabular. They assume shared understanding between scribe and reader. Symbols stand in for commodities, people, and actions without elaboration. This suggests a trained audience within a stable system. One does not need to explain how the world works when everyone involved already knows. Writing here functions less as communication and more as confirmation. The problem this presents is methodological. Historians often look to the earliest written sources for origins, but the Sumerian case resists this approach. The records begin too late to witness the formation of the very systems they describe. Kingship, temples, and cities appear fully articulated at the moment they become visible to us. The tablets do not remember their own beginnings. They remember administration. This creates a silence that is difficult to interpret. It does not necessarily mean that no origin stories existed. It may mean they were not considered relevant to daily governance, or it may suggest that the origins lay beyond living memory, treated as inherited rather than discovered. In such a framework, the past is not something to be reconstructed, but something to be upheld. The role of the scribe is not to explain how things came to be, but to ensure they continue correctly. Later mythological compositions, when they do address beginnings, often do so indirectly. They situate order as descending or being assigned, rather than invented. Authority is granted, not devised. Even divine assemblies operate according to established hierarchies. The Anunnaki, when they appear in the texts, enter a world already structured. Their presence is marked, but not explanatory. They are inserted into a chronology, not placed at its absolute start. This raises an important question about how the Sumerians themselves understood time. The emphasis on continuity suggests a worldview in which the present is an extension of a remembered order. Catastrophe interrupts, but does not redefine. Restoration follows disruption. Memory, rather than innovation, becomes the primary engine of civilization. Writing serves this memory, anchoring it against loss. Yet memory itself has limits. The earliest tablets do not reach far enough back to capture the moment. When cities first coalesced or authority first centralized, they register only that these things are already in place. For the modern observer, this creates a sense of arriving after the fact, stepping into a conversation already underway. The beginning has already passed. If the records do not preserve the birth of cities, but only their operation, then where does the story of emergence reside? Is it buried beneath the earliest levels of occupation, or encoded in architectural continuity rather than text? And if writing begins only once the city is already mature, what does that imply about the nature of those cities that existed before they were ever recorded? The sense of belatedness deepens when the ground itself is examined. Beneath the tablets, beneath the walls, beneath even the earliest written memory, there are cities already in progress. Excavation does not reveal a single moment of arrival, a foundational gesture that announces itself as the beginning. Instead, it exposes sequences layers of use, rebuilding, adjustment suggesting that urban life settled into place gradually, without ceremony. At Eridu, the earliest occupational levels do not present a dramatic transformation from emptiness to settlement. What appears instead is a steady accumulation of structures, one built upon another, often aligned with remarkable consistency. Temples are rebuilt on the same axis, walls repaired rather than replaced, spaces reused with slight modification. This pattern implies not experimentation, but familiarity. Builders seem to know where things belong. The sacred precinct does not wander across the landscape. It holds its position as if anchored by memory. The earliest buildings at Eridu are modest, but they are not tentative. Their orientation, internal divisions, and repeated reconstruction suggest a shared understanding of function. There is no archaeological signature of improvisation. Materials change slowly. Technique is refined, but the underlying plan persists. This continuity is difficult to reconcile with the idea of a newly invented urban form. It suggests instead a community already accustomed to living this way, adapting inherited practices to local conditions. A similar picture emerges at Uruk, though on a far larger scale. Here, the growth of the city is expansive, but not chaotic. The monumental precincts develop over time, each phase respecting the spatial logic of the previous one. Streets follow established paths. Administrative buildings cluster where they have clustered before. The city grows denser, not different. Even as population increases and architecture becomes more complex, the underlying organization remains stable. What is striking is the absence of a clear founding layer. Archaeologists can identify early phases, but none announce themselves as the first. There is no sharp line separating non-city from city. Instead, there is a gradient, a thickening of activity. This makes the notion of a founder difficult to sustain. The city does not appear to have been designed in a single act. It seems to have emerged through sustained occupation, shaped by repetition rather than intention. This challenges later textual traditions that speak of cities being established by divine or heroic figures. When these narratives are compared with the material record, they appear less like historical accounts and more like symbolic explanations layered onto a much older reality. The ground does not preserve the moment when a god arrived and founded a city. It preserves only the patient work of generations who already understood where walls should stand and how space should be used. The architecture itself reinforces this impression. Early buildings are not prototypes. They do not display the awkwardness of first attempts. Doorways align, drainage functions. Storage areas are integrated into domestic and institutional spaces. These are solutions refined over time. They imply a body of practical knowledge transmitted across generations, perhaps orally, perhaps through apprenticeship, but long before it is ever inscribed. Even the choice of location suggests prior understanding. Both Eridu and Uruk occupy landscapes that require careful management of water and resources. Settlement here presupposes knowledge of seasonal flooding, soil behavior, and construction techniques suited to unstable ground. These are not skills acquired instantly. They point to communities that had already learned how to inhabit this environment effectively. The archaeological record, then, presents cities without founders. Or rather, founders who do not announce themselves. The emphasis is not on creation, but on maintenance. Each layer respects what came before, even as it modifies it. This is not the architecture of rupture. It is the architecture of continuity. In this context, the later appearance of mythic arrivals takes on a different tone. When texts describe divine figures entering cities or assigning roles, they do so in places that were already densely inhabited. The Anunnaki, when mentioned, are situated within urban landscapes that predate their textual introduction. The cities do not wait for them to exist. They're already there, functioning, accumulating history beneath the feet of those who will later be said to govern them. This does not diminish the importance of these figures within the Sumerian worldview, but it reframes their role. They are not remembered as builders of the first walls. They are remembered as participants in an order already established. The city, in this sense, is not a product of their arrival, but a stage upon which their authority is expressed. The absence of founders in the archaeological record may reflect how the Sumerians themselves perceived their cities. Perhaps origins were not a matter of interest. What mattered was the correct continuation of inherited forms. A city was legitimate not because it had been founded, but because it endured. Its authority lay in its persistence. If urban life was already well established before it was ever written down or mythologized, then the question shifts. Instead of asking who founded the first cities, we are left to ask how their form and order were remembered and transmitted for so long without record. And if architecture can preserve memory in stone and mud brick, what other kinds of memory might be embedded not in walls, but in language itself? As the built environment suggests, continuity rather than invention, the language preserved on clay reinforces the same orientation. The earliest Sumerian texts do not speak in the grammar of beginnings. They speak instead in forms that assume what already exists. This is not only a matter of what is said, but how it is said. The verbs chosen, the nouns left unexplained, the particles that frame action all point toward a world understood as inherited. In the administrative tablets, actions are rarely marked as originating. Grain is not first allocated. It is redistributed. Labors are not created. They are assigned again. Temples are not founded. They are serviced. The verbs most commonly used describe continuation, maintenance, and return. Even when change occurs, it is framed as adjustment within an existing order. The language does not strain to mark novelty. It settles into repetition. This is particularly visible in terms associated with authority. Words for kingship appear without definitional clauses. The term is used as a given, embedded within transactions and offerings. There is no linguistic marker indicating that kingship is a recent development. Instead, it is treated as a stable category, one that speakers and listeners already recognize. The grammar does not pause to explain power. It presumes italiano. Yet for the modern reader, this absence is telling. If the language of the earliest texts cannot articulate the moment when kingship first emerged, then perhaps kingship was already ancient by the time it needed to be written down. And if authority is linguistically inherited rather than created, how did the Sumerians themselves conceptualize a time before kings were named at all? The linguistic assumption of continuity carries forward into the way time itself is organized in the historical record. When the texts finally turn toward the past, they do not search for origins so much as they arrange succession. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the tradition that later scholars would call the Sumerian king list. These documents, preserved in multiple copies across centuries, does not ask how kingship began. It begins by stating that it already existed. The opening formula is spare and declarative. Kingship is said to have descended. The phrasing does not describe invention, negotiation, or selection. It presumes an established office that changes location, not nature. What matters to the compilers is where kingship resides at a given moment, and how long it remains there. Duration is counted carefully. Names follow one another in sequence. The list is concerned with order, not origin. Before the first named king appears, there is already structure. The list does not describe a leaderless time. It does not imagine chaos preceding authority. Instead, it marks a transition from an unnamed condition to a named one. Kingship exists before kings are identified. Authority precedes individuals. This distinction is subtle but significant. It suggests that the institution is primary, while the person is secondary. In this framework, names function as anchors rather than beginnings. The first kings are not presented as founders. They are presented as occupants of an office that has already arrived. Their reigns are measured not by achievements, but by years. The emphasis is administrative. The list reads less like a story and more like an archive summary, concerned with continuity across time. The extraordinary lengths attributed to early reigns have often drawn attention, but their function within the text is structural rather than fantastical. Long reigns stretch time backward, creating depth. They push the horizon of memory beyond ordinary experience. Whether these numbers were symbolic, schematic, or traditional, their effect is to establish antiquity. Kingship is placed firmly in a distant past, far removed from the present of the scribes. What is absent is equally important. There is no account of how the first king was chosen, no description of a social contract, no narrative of conflict resolved through leadership. The list does not justify kingship, it assumes its legitimacy. This silence suggests that the audience did not require explanation. Kingship was treated as a given condition of the world, much like the city or the temple. Even the transitions between eras are framed in terms of disruption and restoration rather than creation. Floods intervene. Cities fall silent. Then kingship resumes elsewhere. The institution survives catastrophe. It moves, but it does not end. This reinforces the idea that authority is not tied to a specific place or person. It is a transferable order, capable of persistence, despite loss. The compilers of the list were not attempting to reconstruct a forgotten past in the modern sense. They were organizing memory in a way that affirmed continuity. By tracing an unbroken line of succession, interrupted only temporarily, they presented the present as legitimate because it followed from what came before. The past is not explored. It is invoked. This approach aligns with other administrative texts of the period. Authority is recorded, not explained. Offices exist because they exist. The role of the scribe is to ensure that names, reigns, and transitions are properly registered. Writing becomes a means of stabilizing memory, not interrogating it. The Anunnaki appear in related traditions as participants in this order, associated with decisions about kingship and destiny. Yet Evanera, they are not described as inventors of the institution. They confirm, assign, or oversee. Their actions presuppose the framework within which they operate. The list itself does not dwell on their role. It remains focused on the human sequence, grounded in cities and reigns. What emerges is a conception of history that begins not with creation, but with administration. The past is structured through offices rather than events. Kingship is something that descends, resides, departs, and returns. It is older than any name that bears it. For the Sumerians, this may have been sufficient. Origins, if they existed at all, lay beyond the reach of useful memory. For the modern reader, this creates a tension. If the earliest historical document already assumes kingship, then the formative moment lies elsewhere, unrecorded. It may belong to an era before writing, before cities reached their visible form, before language itself needed to explain authority, or it may have been deliberately left outside the record, treated as sacred or inaccessible. If kings were named only after kingship was already established, then what kind of social memory sustained that institution before it could be written down? And how was authority recognized in a time when no one yet carried its name? The assumption of authority continues uninterrupted when the record turns from names and reigns to the quieter world of daily administration. Here, the tablets speak most plainly, and in doing so, they reveal how little explanation the system required. These are not texts composed for memory or posterity. They are working documents, and yet they are among the most revealing. The earliest administrative tablets do not describe institutions. They operate within them. They record deliveries, rations, assignments, inventories. Each tablet presumes an audience that understands exactly what is being recorded and why. Grain is listed beside a sign that needs no clarification. Labor units are counted without defining what constitutes a worker. Places are named without geographical description. The tablet does not teach. It confirms. This creates a particular kind of silence. Administrative writing only functions when a shared framework already exists. A scribe can note that barley has been issued because both scribe and reader already agree on the system that governs storage, entitlement, and obligation. The tablet is not the system. It is evidence that the system is already stable enough to require oversight. What is striking is how early this stability appears. From the first large archives, the structure is already complex. Multiple categories of goods are tracked simultaneously. Different classes of personnel receive different allotments. Temporal markers indicate regular cycles of distribution. This is not the administrative footprint of an emerging order. It is the maintenance record of an established one. The format of the tablets reinforces this impression. Many are standardized in size and layout. Columns are aligned, totals are summarized, errors are corrected. These practices imply training, convention, and expectation. Scribal education itself must have existed before these tablets were produced, because one does not learn such precision while inventing a system. The hand that writes already knows what is required. Even more revealing is what the tablets do not record. They do not explain why certain individuals are entitled to rations and others are not. They do not justify the authority of the institution distributing goods. They do not describe how land came under administrative control. These questions fall outside the scope of the record, not because they are unimportant, but because they are settled. In this sense, the administrative archive functions as a snapshot taken mid-motion. It captures the city while it is already running. Temples manage resources. Officials supervise labor. Scribes ensure continuity. The entire apparatus assumes legitimacy. Writing here is not creative. It is conservative. Its role is to prevent loss, not to introduce change. This perspective alters how we understand the emergence of writing itself. Rather than being a catalyst for civilization, writing appears as a response to an already dense social order. The need to record arises when memory alone is no longer sufficient to manage inherited complexity. Writing extends memory, it does not replace it. The administrative vocabulary further supports this view. Terms for offices and roles appear without elaboration. Titles recur across tablets, suggesting continuity across time and space. The same institutional language persists, even as cities grow and reorganize. This persistence implies that the administrative model itself is older than the tablets that record it. The Anunnaki are absent from most of these documents, and that absence is instructive. The daily functioning of the city does not require reference to divine overseers. The system operates autonomously, guided by precedent and routine. When divine authority is invoked elsewhere, it appears as validation, not as instruction. Administration belongs to the human domain, shaped by inherited norms. What these tablets ultimately suggest is that the Sumerians experienced their civilization as something already in progress. The role of the scribe was not to ask where it came from, but to ensure that it continued correctly. The archive preserves the present tense of an ancient order. For modern observers, this raises a difficult question. If the earliest writing records only the management of inherited institutions, then the formative phase of those institutions lies beyond both text and archive. It belongs to a period remembered only through practice, not narrative. And if writing marks the point at which memory needed reinforcement, what does that imply about the depth and age of the memory that preceded it? The administrative records assume institutions that are already functioning, but the physical spaces in which those institutions operate reveal an even longer continuity. Beneath the tablets and the ration lists lie foundations that were never meant to be temporary. Temples, more than any other structures, preserve the Sumerian relationship to time. They are not simply built, they are returned to. At Eridu, excavation exposes a sequence of temple buildings stacked one upon another, each carefully aligned with the last. The earliest shrine is modest, constructed of perishable materials, yet its successors do not abandon its position. Instead, they rebuild directly above it. Floors are raised, walls are thickened. The sacred footprint remains fixed. This is not architectural convenience. It is deliberate continuity. The builders do not treat earlier structures as obsolete. They treat them as foundations in both the physical and conceptual sense. Each new temple incorporates the memory of the previous one. Even when styles change and materials improve, orientation is preserved. The axis remains stable across centuries. Such consistency suggests that the location itself carried meaning that could not be altered without consequence. This pattern is repeated elsewhere in southern Mesopotamia. Temples are repaired, enlarged, and monumentalized, but rarely relocated. When destruction occurs, whether through decay, flooding, or human action, the response is not to innovate, but to restore. Reconstruction respects precedent. The past dictates the present form. What is notable is that the earliest temples do not look experimental. They already display an understanding of spatial hierarchy. Inner sanctuaries are distinguished from outer areas. Storage and preparation spaces are integrated into the complex. Access is controlled. These features imply ritual routines that predate the buildings themselves. Architecture here responds to practice, not the other way around. The language used in foundation inscriptions reinforces this impression. When later rulers record their building activities, they often speak of renewing or restoring rather than creating. The verb choices emphasize continuity. The temple is something that exists across time, occasionally requiring intervention to return it to proper condition. Even royal involvement is framed as stewardship rather than authorship. This suggests that temples were perceived less as projects and more as obligations. Their maintenance was part of sustaining cosmic and social order. To rebuild a temple was not to assert novelty, but to align oneself with an inherited responsibility. The legitimacy of the act lay in its conformity to what had always been done. The Anunnaki appear in these contexts as associated with temples, but not as their architects. They are linked to presence, authority, and allocation, not to design. The sacred space is already established when they are named. Their role is to inhabit and oversee, not to originate. The temple exists before its divine associations are articulated in writing. Archaeological evidence supports this reading. There is no clear moment when a temple first appears as a concept. Instead, there is gradual elaboration of a space that is already set apart. The earliest shrine does not announce itself as new. It simply occupies ground that will remain sacred for generations. The decision to mark that ground must have been made earlier, in a time that leaves little trace beyond continuity itself. This raises questions about memory and transmission. How did builders know where to rebuild? How were orientations preserved across centuries, especially before writing was widely used for such purposes? The answer likely lies in ritual practice and oral tradition. The act of rebuilding may have been guided by remembered measurements, repeated ceremonies, and embodied knowledge passed from one generation to the next. In Tisense, the temple becomes a material archive. It stores memory not in text, but in alignment, depth, and repetition. Each layer encodes a decision to remember rather than to replace. The city grows around it. Administrations rise and fall, but the sacred center remains constant. This constancy complicates narratives of sudden transformation. If temples were already functioning as focal points of communal life before they were much, then their origins lie in a period of social organization that predates both writing and formal kingship. The temple did not emerge alongside administration. Administration grew around it. For the Sumerians, this may have required no explanation. The temple was simply where it had always been. Its antiquity was self-evident, reinforced by the act of rebuilding itself. Each restoration confirmed the legitimacy of the past. Yet for those looking back through excavation and inscription, the question remains unresolved. If temples preserve memory through architecture rather than narrative, then what kind of knowledge guided their earliest orientations and proportions? And if sacred space was already fixed before it was ever described, what other systems, perhaps even those that measured the heavens, were already in place, silently guiding construction from above as much as from below? The fixed orientations of temples suggest that builders were not working in isolation from the sky above them. Once attention lifts from the ground to the heavens, a similar pattern emerges. The earliest astronomical texts do not read like discoveries. They read like registrations. Stars are not introduced. They are listed. Paths are not defined. They are followed. The sky, like the city, appears already ordered by the time it enters the record. When Sumerian scribes begin to inscribe celestial knowledge, they do so with a tone of familiarity. Star names are recorded without explanation. Constellations are grouped according to established schemes. The texts do not describe how these groupings were devised. They assume the reader already knows what the signs refer to. The act of writing seems less concerned with observation than with preservation. This is particularly evident in later compilations such as Molo Pen, which draws on earlier traditions. Though preserved in first millennium copies, the structure of the text suggests much older roots. It organizes the sky into 3 paths, assigns stars to seasonal risings, and correlates celestial movement with the calendar. The tone is administrative. The heavens are managed much like land or labor. What is striking is the lack of narrative around these observations. The text does not describe a moment when a star was first noticed or a constellation first named. It does not recount debates or revisions. Instead, it presents the sky as a system already stabilized. This implies a long period of prior observation, one extensive enough that patterns became predictable and codified before they were ever written down. The The precision of this knowledge further complicates the picture. Tracking heliacal risings and seasonal shifts requires sustained attention across generations. It demands consistency in observation and a framework for comparing results over time. Such practices are difficult to establish quickly. They suggest inherited routines, passed down and refined long before they are formalized in text. Architectural alignment supports this interpretation. Many temples and ceremonial spaces appear oriented in ways that correspond to cardinal directions or significant celestial events. These orientations are preserved through multiple rebuilding phases. This implies that the builders were responding to a remembered cosmic order, not experimenting with new alignments. The sky provided a reference that outlasted individual structures. The language used in astronomical texts reinforces the sense of inheritance. Verbs describe stars as standing, crossing, or being placed, often without an agent. The grammar does not emphasize human action. It frames celestial order as something that exists independently, something to be observed and respected rather than altered. The scribe records what is already arranged. The Anunnaki enter this domain as part of that arrangement. In certain texts, they are associated with celestial regions or roles within the cosmic order, yet they are not described as inventors of the sky. They occupy positions within it. Their authority appears administrative, overseeing an order that precedes their mention. The heavens do not begin with them. They are integrated into an existing structure. This perspective aligns with the broader Sumerian tendency to treat systems as inherited. Just as kingship descends and temples are restored, the sky is understood as an established framework. Human responsibility lies in correct observation and alignment, not in creation. Astronomy becomes a discipline of memory, ensuring that rituals, calendars, and constructions remain in harmony with what has always been. The absence of origin narratives, in this context, is telling. If the Sumerians possessed myths about the creation of the heavens, they are largely separate from the technical texts. Practical astronomy does not engage with cosmogony. It concerns itself with maintenance of order. This separation suggests that for daily governance, the question of how the sky came to be was less relevant than knowing how it behaves. For the scribes, recording the stars may have been akin to recording grain deliveries. Both are acts of regulation. Both assume stability. Writing fixes relationships that are already trusted. Quintessence astronomical texts are not windows into discovery, but into a long-standing agreement between sky, city, and ritual. Yet this raises a quiet problem. If celestial knowledge appears fully formed at the moment it is written down, then its formative phase lies beyond the textual horizon. Just like kingship and urban planning, the sky was already mapped before it was recorded. Observation preceded inscription by an unknown span of time. If the Sumerians inherited a sky already organized into paths and cycles, then what systems of counting and measurement allowed them to track such precision across generations? And how were those systems preserved before they, too, were finally committed to clay? The sky could only be tracked if time and quantity were already disciplined. Beneath the star lists and temple alignments lies another inherited structure, quieter still, but no less revealing. The earliest numerical systems do not behave like inventions. They behave like inheritances that have already been standardized before anyone thought to explain them. The first numerical impressions on clay are not exploratory marks. They are precise, differentiated, and context-sensitive. Different commodities are counted with different numerical signs. Grain, livestock, labor, and land each follow their own conventions. This is not a single counting system gradually adapted to multiple uses. It is a set of parallel systems already in operation. The scribe selects the appropriate signs without commentary, as if misuse were unthinkable. This complexity appears at the very beginning of written administration. From the earliest tablets, numbers are embedded within institutional routines. They are used to allocate rations, calculate work obligations, and measure fields. There is no evidence of numerical uncertainty. Totals are confidently computed. Subtotals are reconciled. Errors, when they occur, are corrected according to known rules. This suggests that calculation was already a practiced skill long before it left a material trace. Central to this structure is what later scholars would describe as the sexagesimal system. Its presence is implicit from the start. Units based on 60 appear not as theoretical constructs, but as working tools. They are applied consistently across contexts, from time reckoning to spatial measurement. Such coherence implies deep familiarity. One does not casually arrive at a base so mathematically demanding without sustained use. What is notable is how seamlessly this numerical order integrates with other inherited systems. Astronomical cycles align with numerical divisions. Administrative schedules correspond to counted intervals. Architectural proportions reflect modular measurement. The same numerical logic appears to govern sky, city, and storage. This unity suggests that numbers were not developed piecemeal to solve isolated problems. They belong to a comprehensive framework already understood as coherent. The tablets do not pause to teach this framework. There are no explanatory treatises among the earliest records. Calculation is assumed knowledge. The scribe writes numbers as one would write words in a familiar language. This implies training that predates writing itself. Numerical knowledge must have been transmitted through practice, demonstration, and repetition long before it was fixed in clay. Trade, often imagined as a driver of numerical innovation, appears here as a beneficiary rather than a cause. By the time exchange is documented, measurement is already precise. Weights and capacities are standardized. Values are comparable across contexts. This level of regularity suggests that the numerical system was not developed in response to trade, but that trade expanded within a pre-existing quantitative order. The Anunnaki are largely absent from numerical contexts, and again the absence is instructive. Numbers do not require divine attribution in the administrative record. Measurement operates autonomously, governed by convention and precedent. Where divine authority appears in later texts, it tends to validate outcomes rather than define units. The numerical world runs quietly beneath theology, sustaining it without drawing attention. This reinforces the sense that Sumerian civilization experienced itself as operating within inherited limits. Numbers were not tools of innovation, but of alignment. They ensured that actions conformed to established ratios, that time unfolded correctly, that offerings were sufficient. Calculation was an act of preservation. The maturity of this system raises difficult questions about chronology. If such numerical sophistication appears fully formed at the dawn of writing, then its development must belong to an earlier phase of social organization. That phase leaves little direct evidence. It is visible only through the confidence of later use. The numbers speak not of their birth, but of their endurance. For the Sumerians, this may have required no reflection. To count correctly was simply to act properly. The rules of number were part of the world's order, much like the path of a star or the orientation of a temple. Writing made them visible, but did not create them. Yet numbers do more than measure goods and time. They define obligations, limits, and equivalence. They make comparison possible. In doing so, they quietly prepare the ground for judgment. If quantities can be fixed and expectations standardized, then disputes can be resolved by reference rather than force. If numerical order was already inherited before trade expanded and administration intensified, then at what point did this quantitative logic begin to shape ideas of fairness and responsibility? And how did it eventually crystallize into rules that governed not just goods and labor, but conduct itself? The numerical order that governs goods and labor does not remain confined to measurement. Gradually, and almost without announcement, it begins to govern behavior. The earliest legal formulations do not present themselves as bold declarations. They appear as extensions of administrative logic, applying established measures of balance and equivalence to human conduct. Law, in this context, does not arrive as invention. It emerges as formalized memory. The oldest legal texts preserved from southern Mesopotamia do not attempt to define justice in abstract terms. They assume a shared understanding of what is proper and improper. When a rule is written, it is framed as a clarification rather than a revelation. The text does not persuade. It records. This tone suggests that the principles being inscribed were already operative in practice, long before they were impressed into clay. This is evident in the structure of early law collections, such as the Code of Yernamu. The surviving fragments do not open with philosophical justification. They proceed directly to cases. If a particular harm occurs, a specific remedy follows. The language is conditional and precise. It does not ask whether compensation should exist. It assumes that it does. The task of the lawgiver is not to create norms, but to fix them in an authoritative form. The remedies themselves are revealing. Many offenses are addressed through fines rather than corporal punishment. This implies a valuation system already in place, one capable of translating harm into quantified restitution. Such translation requires more than legal imagination. It presupposes agreement about relative worth, responsibility, and proportional response. These agreements must have been reached earlier, through custom and precedent rather than decree. The legal vocabulary reinforces this sense of inheritance. Terms for wrongdoing, compensation, and obligation appear without explanation. The texts do not define what constitutes injury or loss. They proceed as if these concepts are already understood. Law here is not a space for debate. It is a mechanism for consistency. Writing ensures that similar cases receive similar outcomes, anchoring judgment to memory rather than discretion. Kingship plays a particular role in this process. The king is presented as the guarantor of justice, but not its author. In prologues and inscriptions, rulers speak of establishing fairness or restoring order. The verbs emphasize correction. Law is something that can be neglected or distorted and therefore must be set right. The king's legitimacy rests on his ability to align present practice with inherited norms. This alignment extends beyond human society. Legal texts often invoke cosmic order, suggesting that justice is not merely social convenience, but part of a larger balance. Yet aven era, the emphasis is not on revelation. The gods do not announce new laws. They endorse the maintenance of what is already proper. Divine authority stabilizes law, but does not innovate it. The Anunnaki, when associated with judgment in later traditions, occupy this stabilizing role. They are linked to decrees and destinies, but their actions occur within an already articulated framework of right and wrong. They confirm outcomes rather than define categories. Their presence reinforces the impression that law, like kingship, descends as an institution rather than emerging through human experimentation. What is absent from the legal record is as telling as what remains. There are no stories of the first trial, no accounts of a society learning how to resolve conflict. Dispute resolution is treated as an established necessity. Writing enters only when it becomes important to standardize decisions across space and time. Law becomes archival. This archival quality suggests that early Sumerian law functioned as a memory aid. It preserved decisions that had already proven acceptable. By recording them, the society reduced reliance on individual recollection. Authority shifted from personal judgment to documented precedent. The written law did not replace custom et security italiano. Such a process implies a long prehistory of unwritten norms. Before a case could be written, it had to be recognized. Before compensation could be fixed, value had to be agreed upon. These agreements likely formed gradually, embedded in daily practice and ritual expectation. Writing did not create them. It selected and froze them at a particular moment. For the Sumerians, this may have been the natural role of law. It was not a space for innovation, but for preservation. The goal was not to imagine better rules, but to ensure that known rules endured. Justice lay in consistency with the past. From a modern perspective, this raises a quiet difficulty. If the earliest laws are already formalizations of earlier practice, then the formative period of legal reasoning lies beyond the written record, just as the origins of kingship and measurement do. Law appears suddenly mature because its maturation occurred elsewhere, in time not yet inscribed. If justice was already understood before it was ever written down, then what social processes shaped those understandings? And how were ideas of right conduct preserved, transmitted, and enforced in the long period before the law itself learned to speak in text? The logic of law rests on balance and precedent, and that same logic appears again when the tablets turn toward the human body. Illness, like injury or theft, is treated not as an anomaly requiring invention, but as a condition that must be recognized, classified, and corrected according to known patterns. The earliest medical texts do not search for causes in the abstract. They assume that the body, like society, follows rules that can be remembered. Medical tablets from Mesopotamia are striking for their composure. Symptoms are listed with restraint. Prognoses are delivered without drama. Treatments are prescribed as if they belong to a familiar repertoire. The tone is administrative rather than speculative. The scribe records what is to be done, not why it was first discovered. Healing is presented as a practiced craft, grounded in accumulated knowledge. One of the clearest examples of this inherited approach appears in the diagnostic tradition later compiled as the Although preserved in later copies, the structure of the text points to much older routes. It organizes illness according to observable signs, arranging them in sequences that move from head to foot, from onset to outcome. Each symptom is treated as meaningful within a known system. The physician's task is not to experiment, but to recognize. The language of these texts emphasizes observation and memory. Phrases recur across tablets, suggesting formulaic transmission. If a patient presents in a certain way, a known outcome is expected. If another set of signs appears, a different course follows. This conditional structure mirrors that of legal texts. Both depend on precedent. Both rely on the idea that past cases can guide present judgment. What is notable is the absence of exploratory language. The texts do not describe physicians discovering new treatments or debating competing explanations. Remedies are applied as established responses, even when outcomes are uncertain. The uncertainty itself is categorized. Prognosis becomes part of the system. The physician operates within defined limits, guided by what has been seen before. This approach implies long familiarity with illness and recovery. The body is not treated as a mystery newly encountered. It is understood as something already mapped through experience. The categories of disease suggest sustained observation across generations. Such mapping would have required careful attention long before it was ever formalized in writing. Ritual elements often accompany medical prescriptions, but they do not disrupt the overall tone. Incantations are listed alongside physical treatments, not as innovations, but as components of a complete response. The coexistence of ritual and empirical practice is not presented as a contradiction. It reflects an integrated worldview in which physical and social order are intertwined. Healing restores balance, just as law restores justice and administration restores order. The vocabulary used to describe illness reinforces this sense of restoration. Many terms imply disturbance rather than creation. The body is out of alignment. Something has shifted. Treatment aims to return it to its proper state. This mirrors the language used for temples and laws. In each case, the ideal condition is assumed to pre-exist the disruption. The role of the healer, like that of the scribe or judge, is conservative. Authority derives from knowledge of established patterns. Training would have involved memorization, repetition, and apprenticeship rather than innovation. The effectiveness of treatment depended on correct application of inherited methods, not on personal insight. Divine references appear in medical texts, but again, they do not dominate. Gods may be named as associated with certain conditions or invoked for support, yet the structure of diagnosis remains systematic. The Anunnaki are not presented as inventors of medicine. When divine agency is acknowledged, it frames illness within a larger order rather than explaining technique. The practical knowledge remains human, embedded in tradition. This suggests that medical understanding developed gradually within the same inherited frameworks that shaped law and administration. Writing did not create medical knowledge. It stabilized it. By committing diagnoses and treatments to clay, the society ensured that hard-won experience would not be lost. Medicine became archival. As with other domains, this archival moment comes late. The sophistication of the texts implies a long prehistory of unwritten practice. Bodies had been observed, symptoms correlated, outcomes remembered. The written record captures a mature system already confident in its categories. For the Sumerians, illness was not an opportunity for theoretical speculation. It was a problem to be managed according to known responses. The past guided the present. Healing was an act of continuity. Yet the medical texts also gestured toward a boundary. They acknowledge forces beyond human control, moments when prognosis turns unfavorable despite correct practice. In those moments, divine order is invoked not to explain failure, but to situate it. The healer reaches the edge of inherited knowledge. If medicine, like law and number, reflects a disciplined memory that predates writing, then how did early practitioners decide which conditions belonged within human remedy and which were assigned to divine judgment? And at what point did figures like the Anunnaki become associated with those boundaries rather than with the knowledge itself? Where medicine reaches its limits, the texts do not collapse into speculation. They turn instead toward administration on a larger scale. In this broader register, the Anunnaki begin to appear more clearly not as healers, not as inventors, but as figures associated with allocation, oversight, and the maintenance of order. Their present enters the record not at the point of origin, but at points of regulation. In Sumerian textual traditions, references to the Anunnaki rarely introduce a new world. They assume one. The language surrounding them is procedural rather than dramatic. They assemble. They decide. They assign roles. These actions are described as if they occur within an already functioning system that requires governance rather than creation. The world does not begin when they arrive. It is already underway. This is especially evident in texts that describe divine councils. These assemblies resemble administrative gatherings more than creative events. Decisions concern distribution of authority, confirmation of offices, or responses to disruption. The tone mirrors that of human institutions. Justice scribes record meetings of officials and outcomes of judgments. The texts record divine deliberations as part of a familiar bureaucratic rhythm. The Anunnaki are thus framed as participants in governance rather than authors of structure. They do not explain why kingship exists. They are associated with its regulation. They do not establish temples. They are connected to their functioning. Even when their authority is emphasized, it is exercised through confirmation and decree, not through invention. This suggests that their role was understood as stabilizing an inherited order. Their placement within the texts reinforces this interpretation. References to them often appear in contexts of transition or crises. When boundaries are threatened, when balance is disturbed, their involvement is noted. They are invoked where continuity is at risk. This aligns with the broader Sumerian tendency to see authority as something that intervenes to restore, not to originate. The language used to describe their actions supports this view. Verbs emphasize assignment and determination. Destiny are set. Roles are fixed. Outcomes are decided. These are administrative acts. They presuppose categories already in existence. One cannot assign a role that has not been defined. One cannot confirm an office that does not already exist. The grammar quietly implies prior structure. Importantly, the Anunnaki are not consistently foregrounded. Many texts operate entirely without reference to them. Administration, law, medicine, and calculation proceed without divine mention. This selective presence suggests that their role was not to manage daily operations, but to anchor the system at moments when legitimacy needed reinforcement. Their authority is episodic, not constant. This episodic quality distinguishes them from creators. A creator must be present at the beginning. The Anunnaki appear after beginnings have already passed. They enter a narrative that is already populated with cities, offices, and routines. Their arrival marks a phase, not an origin. In T-sense, they function as temporal markers within the Sumerian conception of history. Later interpretive traditions sometimes blur this distinction, reading creative intent into their actions. Yet when the earliest language is examined carefully, the emphasis remains on regulation. The Anunnaki oversee divisions of labor among gods and humans. They participate in judgments. They affirm boundaries. These are tasks suited to an existing order, not to a world being formed for the first time. This understanding aligns with how Sumerian texts treat authority more generally. Power is legitimate because it is continuous, not because it is new. Kings restore justice. Temples are rebuilt. Laws reaffirm precedent. The Anunnaki fit into this pattern. They are guarantors of continuity at a scale beyond human reach. Their association with destiny is particularly revealing. Destiny, in these texts, is not an open-ended future. It is a path that can be set, altered, or reaffirmed, but always within a known framework. To set destiny is to align events with an established order. The Anunnaki's involvement in this process suggests that they were understood as custodians of memory at the cosmic level. This custodial role may explain why their arrival is treated as significant without being foundational. They matter because they intervene in the management of an already complex world. Their authority becomes relevant when human institutions alone are insufficient to maintain balance. They appear where inherited systems strain under pressure. What remains unresolved is a temporal relationship implied by their arrival. If cities, kingship, and administration predate their appearance in the texts, then their arrival marks a threshold rather than a beginning. It suggests a before and an after, but not in terms of creation. Something changes, but something essential remains. The texts do not spell out what that change was. They do not describe a pristine era giving way to divine rule, nor a chaotic world suddenly ordered. They are more restrained. They note participation, oversight, and decree. The Anunnaki enter as administrators of destiny, not as architects of existence. This restraint leaves space for interpretation, but it also imposes limits. The Sumerians themselves did not treat the Anunnaki as explanatory solutions to the problem of origins. They treated them as part of the record of governance. Their memory is institutional, not speculative. If the Anunnaki functioned as markers of regulation rather than creation, then their arrival implies that something required regulation at a new scale. It suggests a moment when inherited systems encountered stress or disruption significant enough to be remembered in divine terms. What kind of disruption would necessitate such oversight? And does the archaeological and textual record preserve traces of a rupture so profound that it redefined the balance between continuity and survival itself? The sense of strain implied by divine oversight finds its material counterpart in the ground itself. In several Mesopotamian cities, continuity is interrupted by a thin but unmistakable line. It is not a wall, nor a foundation, but a layer of silt clean, water-laid, and foreign to the surrounding deposits. Archaeologists encounter it as a pause in occupation, a moment when the accumulated routines of city life were briefly erased. At Surupak, this layer is particularly clear. Beneath it lie domestic floors, hearths, and refuse typical of sustained habitation. Above it, rebuilding begins again. The silt itself contains little human material. It does not belong to the city. It arrives from elsewhere, settles, and then departs. The city resumes only after it has passed. This sequence suggests an event rather than a gradual environmental shift. Similar flood deposits have been identified at other sites, though not always at the same stratigraphic level. The lack of perfect alignment has often been noted, but this does not diminish their significance. Floods need not be simultaneous to be culturally remembered. What matters is that they were disruptive enough to leave a mark, both in the earth and in collective memory. Each city experienced interruption, not annihilation. Life did not end. It was suspended. The texts that refer to floods reflect this same emphasis. They do not describe the creation of a new world. They describe survival and restoration. In Tablet the 11th of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood narrative is framed as a remembered catastrophe within an already ancient history. Cities exist before the flood. Kings rule before it. Knowledge is present, threatened, and then carried through the disruption. The focus is not on origin, but on continuity under extreme pressure. What is preserved is selective. Certain individuals survive. Certain practices endure. After the waters recede, kingship returns. Temples are rebuilt. The social order resumes its familiar shape. The flood marks a boundary, but not a beginning. It separates one phase of memory from another. The world after the flood is not new. It is recovered. The archaeological layers support this reading. Above flood deposit, building resumes in recognizable forms. Orientation is maintained. Institutional spaces reappear. There is no evidence of radical experimentation following these events. Instead, there is an urgency to restore what was lost. The past serves as a template for recovery, memory guides, reconstruction. This suggests that floods were understood not as creative forces, but as tests of endurance. They did not redefine civilization. They threatened to erase it. Survival depended on preserving knowledge across the break. Those who rebuilt did so with reference to what had been before, not in response to what the flood had imposed. The Anunnaki appear in flood traditions, not as agents of creation, but as participants in judgment and decision. They deliberate, they respond, they set limits. Their involvement frames the flood as an event within a moral and administrative order, not as a random act. Yet, Ebenar, their role is not to start history anew. It is to manage a crisis within an existing continuum. This management perspective aligns with the material record. Flood layers do not signal a reset, they signal interruption. The thickness of the silt varies, but its meaning remains consistent. It represents a moment when ordinary processes failed. Administration paused. Architecture dissolved. Writing ceased. When these resumed, they did so with urgency and familiarity. One of the most telling aspects of the flood narratives is what they omit. There is little interest in describing how people learned to live again. That knowledge is assumed to survive. Techniques, measurements, rituals, and laws are not rediscovered. They are remembered. The narrative energy is spent on preservation, not reinvention. This emphasis on memory over novelty reinforces the broader patterns seen throughout the Sumerian record. Civilization is treated as something fragile, but persistent, capable of being damaged, yet recoverable if knowledge is carried through disruption. The flood becomes the ultimate test of this principle. It challenges whether memory itself can survive catastrophe. Archaeology cannot tell us how that memory was preserved, only that it was. The resumption of complex life after flood deposits implies coordination, shared expectations, and trusted practices. These could not have been improvised. They required continuity of understanding across generations, even when material traces were temporarily erased. For the Sumerians, floods were not abstract myths. They were lived experiences, remembered in layers of clay and silt. The stories that grew around them did not seek to explain the origin of the world. They sought to explain how the world endured. The flood marked a before and an after, but both belong to the same story. This places the flood at a pivotal point in the investigation. It represents the clearest moment of rupture visible in both text and soil. Yet ebb and air the core pattern holds. What follows is not invention, but restoration. The systems of kingship, measurement, law, and ritual resume, as if recalled rather than designed. If floods functioned as remembered boundaries rather than creative beginnings, then similar memories might exist elsewhere, preserved in different landscapes and traditions. If so, the Sumerian experience would not be unique, but part of a wider human effort to remember civilization across catastrophe. If the flood marks not the birth of order but its most severe test, then where else might traces of such remembered worlds appear? And how might they echo beyond Mesopotamia and the records of other early societies? The idea that civilization survives catastrophe through memory rather than invention does not remain confined to Mesopotamia. When the Sumerian record is placed alongside other early traditions, the familiar pattern emerges not as proof of contact or shared origin, but as a recurring way of understanding the past across distant cultures. Moments of disruption are remembered not as beginnings, but as interruptions followed by restoration. In ancient Egypt, historical texts do not dwell on the invention of kingship. Authority is presented as eternal, disrupted only briefly during periods of disorder. The concept, later called matorder, Balan's correctness, is treated as something that always exists and must be restored when damaged. Kings boast not of creating order, but of re-establishing it after neglect. The language mirrors the Sumerian emphasis on continuity. Civilization is assumed to pre-exist crisis. A similar orientation appears in early South Asian traditions. Archaeological layers in the Indus Valley reveal long periods of urban continuity punctuated by decline and reorganization. When later texts reflect on the distant past, they often frame knowledge as something lost and recovered, rather than newly discovered. Sacred law is remembered as ancient, revealed again when forgotten. The past is treated as deeper than the present can fully access. These parallels do not require shared catastrophe or migration. They suggest a shared human problem: how to account for complex social systems that appear already mature in the earliest records. When writing arrives late, it encounters institutions that feel older than memory. Cultures respond by framing origins as inheritance rather than invention. Authority descends. Knowledge is restored. Order returns. Order returns in Light. The Sumerian flood narratives appear less exceptional. They are one expression of a broader pattern in which catastrophe serves as a boundary in memory. Before the boundary lies an era of fullness, often described vaguely. After it lies recovery. The precise details of the earlier world are rarely preserved. What survives is the conviction that something valuable existed and that it must be carried forward. The mechanism of this carrying forward differs from place to place. In some traditions, it is attributed to survivors, sages, or ancestors. In others, to divine preservation. Yet the function is similar. Memory is externalized into ritual, law, architecture, and story. These become vessels through which civilization passes intact across periods of loss. In Mesopotamia, this vessel takes an administrative form. The emphasis is on lists, measures, offices, and procedures. In Egypt, it is expressed through monumental continuity and theological stability. In South Asia, through textual transmission and ritual repetition. Each culture encodes memory in ways suited to its environment and priorities. None present civilization as a sudden invention. This comparative perspective does not diminish the specificity of the Sumerian record. On the contrary, it sharpens Italiano. The Sumerians were unusually explicit in preserving administrative detail. Their tablets show civilization, mid-operation, sustained by inherited systems. Other cultures preserve the same continuity more symbolically. Together, they suggest that early societies experienced themselves as custodians rather than pioneers. The Anunnaki fit within this wider pattern as well. Figures who oversee destiny, judgment, or cosmic balance appear in many traditions. They are not creators, they intervene when order falters. Their presence marks points of transition rather than origin. They function as guardians of continuity, ensuring that memory survives disruption. What emerges is not a single shared story, but a shared posture toward the past. The deepest past is treated as already ordered, already meaningful, but partially inaccessible. Writing, ritual, and architecture do not reconstruct it fully. They gesture toward it. Civilization, in this sense, lives with the awareness that it is continuing something whose beginning lies beyond reach. This awareness may explain why early cultures invested so heavily in preservation. When the past is felt to be fragile, repetition becomes essential. Rebuilding a temple on the same axis, counting with the same units, enforcing the same laws, these acts stabilize memory. They protect civilization against the amnesia that catastrophe threatens to impose. Shunti's why the Sumerian experience is neither isolated nor anomalous. It is one expression of a broader human strategy. To survive loss by treating knowledge as inheritance, the flood becomes a model for understanding all disruption. What matters is not how the world begins again, but how it remembers itself. Yet this comparative lens also introduces uncertainty. If multiple cultures preserve memories of earlier, fuller orders, then distinguishing between shared human response and shared historical experience becomes difficult. The echoes may arise from similar conditions rather than common events. If global traditions independently frame civilization as something remembered rather than invented, then what does that say about the nature of early human history itself and how much of that history lies beyond the reach of both? Excavation and texts preserved only as a conviction that something important came before. The investigation does not conclude with an answer so much as with a pattern that refuses to resolve into origins. Across tablets, layers, and vocabularies, civilization appears not as a spark, but as a continuation. The Sumerian record consistently treats its world as something already in motion, occasionally interrupted, repeatedly restored, and carefully maintained. What writing captures is not the birth of order, but its stewardship. This perspective reframes the earliest evidence. Writing arrives late, when systems are already dense enough to require reinforcement. Cities show no founding moment, only accumulation. Language encodes institutions as assumed realities. Numbers operate with confidence. Law formalizes precedent. Medicine categorizes experience. Even the divine figures associated with governance enter as regulators, not creators. The record behaves as if the most important work has already been done elsewhere. Earlier, beyond the point where memory could still speak plainly. The emphasis on restoration over invention is consistent. Temples are rebuilt, not relocated. Justice is reestablished, not defined. After floods, order resumes according to remembered templates. This suggests that, for the Sumerians, legitimacy lay in alignment with what had come before. Innovation was not celebrated as progress. It was treated cautiously, even invisibly, folded back into continuity as quickly as possible. In T's light, the arrival of the Anunnaki reads less like a beginning and more like a response. Their presence is invoked when balance is threatened, when destinies must be fixed, when boundaries require confirmation. They are administrators of memory at a scale larger than human institutions. Their authority operates within an inherited world, reinforcing it at moments of strain. They do not explain the existence of civilization. They presuppose it. What remains striking is the absence of curiosity about first causes. The Sumerian texts do not ask how society began. They ask how it should continue. This is not a failure of imagination. It is a reflection of priorities. In a world where survival depends on maintaining fragile systems, attention turns toward preservation. The past becomes a resource to be guarded, not a puzzle to be solved. From a modern standpoint, this creates attention. Our questions seek origins, but the record offers maintenance. We look for invention, but find inheritance. The gap between these perspectives cannot be closed by adding more data alone. It reflects a difference in how time itself is understood. For the Sumerians, the deep past was not a place of novelty. It was a reservoir of authority. This does not mean that change did not occur. Cities expanded. Technologies refined. Social arrangements shifted. But change was absorbed into existing frameworks. It was made to look like continuity. Writing played a crucial role in this process, not by introducing new ideas, but by fixing old ones in durable form. Clay tablets became anchors, holding memories steady against the erosion of time and disaster. The investigation therefore arrives at a threshold rather than a conclusion. Civilization, as seen through the Sumerian record, behaves like something remembered across loss. Its beginnings lie beyond the reach of its own texts. The Anunnaki appear not at the dawn, but at moments when memory requires reinforcement. Floods do not erase order. They test whether it can be recalled. What we are left with is not a hidden origin story waiting to be uncovered, but a consistent refusal to locate origin within the record itself. The Sumerians seem to have accepted that the deepest foundations of their world were already ancient, already settled, and already authoritative by the time anyone thought to write them down. If civilization was experienced as inheritance rather than invention, then the question shifts. Instead of asking who began it, we are compelled to ask how such complex knowledge could be carried, preserved, and trusted for so long without record, and what, if anything, might have been lost before the memory of civilization learned how to write itself.